Hi. When I left off doing the last video on Genesis on 6:5 to 8, I had listed at the end that we would just continue now in the next few verses 6:9 to 13. But it's quite plain that we need to stop and pause, as I've done a number of times in this whole program, to take stock of some of the interpretive issues that face us as we enter into this story. And this is the longest continuous story in Genesis other than the Joseph story, or we might call it the story of Jacob's family, from Genesis 37 to 50. And here it is from 6 to 9, so it's 4 chapters. And we've seen already no story has been longer than 2 chapters. The Garden of Eden was chapter 2 and 3, but the authors of Genesis, as the authors of the Bible usually are very compact with language, and individual scenes and stories are often very short. They're amazingly good at providing quite a strong picture with a few words. Some of that's practical, some of that has to do with the cost of writing material and the awkwardness of a long scroll, and some of it has to do with the ability to convey stories efficiently, unlike our world where space is basically free on the internet and such in the post-paper world, and so words can be multiplied endlessly, as we know all too well. But they were working with a different context, where words were common, but paper was scarce, or forms of writing was scarce. So to have this longest story really shows how important it is. It's almost half of the entire primeval history. But before we start into it, we have to explore some basic questions, because the flood story has been the hinge upon which historical critical scholarship starting in the 18th century turned, and the question of whether the Bible could be taken literally true, or its truth had to be taken some other way, or whether it would be written off completely as just fantasy or fiction, as many people in the modern world have from an intellectual perspective that really doesn't understand what the Bible is, really the flip side of fundamentalism. And much of that those views form around the flood story. So I've provided on the right side of the screen a list of some of the questions we need to look at, and hopefully before this video is done we'll have some resources for you to make some sense of this for yourselves. But one of my challenges is some scholars have given themselves their entire career to each one of these 8 themes, and I'm not going to give my whole career to it, nor am I going to expect you to spend an enormous amount of time on it. So I'm going to try to balance providing enough insight without drowning you in the details. And so let's just start right in. So formationally, almost all scholars, other than the absolute most literalists, believe there are 2 sources that exist in Genesis. And the easy way to see that is right here. So traditionally it's understood as the J version. We've looked at some of that before when we looked at the creation stories and asked whether there's 1 or 2 creation stories. The traditional view is the P story, or priestly one, is chapters 1 to chapter 2 verse 4a, and then the J or Yahweh's version takes over with the Garden of Eden story. But that's a different kettle of fish, so to speak, because one story exists and another story exists, and it's certainly easy to read them sequentially as 2 different variations rather than the same story. But here, as you can see on the screen, it's the same story, at least in the sense that there's a Noah who's told to make a flood and put animals in it, and then there's a flood, and then they come out of the flood, and then God says something. So you can see the J version here, which is relatively short, as you'll see in a moment. It's this 1 column and a part, and the P version is that column, but also this whole other part, so it's longer. And as we go through the story itself, you'll see how scholars reach judgments on some of this. But the discovery of this in the 18th century is what led Julius Wellhausen, who we've looked at before, among other scholars, to develop what was traditionally known as the documentary hypothesis. And in that earlier argument was that J came first, that the Yahwist author was writing in what they called the Solomonic Enlightenment in the 10th century, in the time of Solomon, when supposedly culture was high and there was peace, and so there was enough luxury and prosperity to allow for culture development. That's never made sense to me personally, especially in relation to Genesis, because so much of the so-called J version plainly is about Babel and Babylon, as we'll see when we get to chapter 11. And why would people in the Solomonic Enlightenment be concerned with Babylon, which was not a major power at that time? So I've always thought, in the time I've been doing this work myself, that whatever J version there was had to come from some later time, and my own view is that both the J version as we have it and the P version are exilic. Scholars have now come around mostly to a similar version, but they still argue about it in great depth. For one thing, they tend to refer to the J version now as non-P, which is an awkward entity, which I don't like to do. And the reason they're doing that is they can simply say, we don't know whose version it is. We don't know where it came from. We no longer believe in Wellhausen's view of Solomonic enlightenment, but we're not sure if it's before P, after P, who wrote it, when. So I'm not going to get into the weeds of that, but plainly there are two different stories, and one you can see clearly in the J version. You can see Lord capitalized there. It's called Yahweh because it uses the name Yahweh for God. And the P version you can see just the normal English God, God, which is for the Elohim in Hebrew. Those are one of the most obviously visual differences. There are also differences in characterization that we'll see as we go. So one of the questions is, how did this happen? Why did it happen? When did it happen? Who made it happen? And I'm not going to try to answer all those, but one of the implications as well is, how did we get the version we have? Because what you see on the screen here is plainly these two stories extracted from the Genesis text, and you can see they're not continuous in the Genesis text, but involve little pieces here and that are woven together. And scholars often take the further argument that some pieces of one of these are missing based on some literary judgment on the transition or the clarity or the content that seems to conflict in one way or another. So in other words, scholars are arguing about it as much now as they ever have. Some arguing that non-P is before P, some arguing that it's the other way around, and some arguing that there's a third writer, and there certainly had to be a third writer, at least an editor, somebody who interwove these together, who had their own view. Is there a difference in theology? Is there a difference in anything other than style? Some of that we'll have to look at as we go. My own view of this, but I certainly can't prove this any more than anybody else can prove theirs, is that both authors were writing from the time of exile. We know that many of the biblical texts are from exile, for example, Ezekiel and almost certainly Leviticus and certainly the late parts of Jeremiah. So the community of exiles was relatively small. The Babylonians only took the elite from Jerusalem, and Jerusalem wasn't exactly a giant city at that time anyway. So the elite would have been a small percentage. So whether that was 100 people or a few hundred people, it probably wasn't much more than that, and if they were there across a couple of generations, 50 years is the understanding of how long the exile lasted, then certainly a lot of them knew each other if they didn't all know each other. Perhaps like early Cubans escaping Castro in Florida formed a small community until many more Cubans came than there were former Jerusalemites in Babylon, given the relative population scales of their world and ours. But I think it's perfectly reasonable to posit that they knew each other and perhaps wrote side by side, perhaps like musicians or playwrights or dramatists making different versions of the same original text material. But that begs the question of original text material. So that takes us on to the next issue here, is this cultural context. Almost all scholars, in fact all critical scholars, would say that the Genesis story has something to do with Mesopotamian stories that existed before it. When this argument was first made, it led many conservative Christian readers to fight back with great power and passion, because they believed that the challenge was that would mean the Bible wasn't quote-unquote true if it was imitating or taking its language from some other story, which was certainly understood as mythological. So if people were reading the Bible as they had, as factual history of God and Israel and God and the rest of the peoples of those time, then the discovery of the Mesopotamian parallel stories threatened to undermine the truth category of the Bible. I'm not going to look at that now, but that's related to the next question of historical, so we'll look at those largely together. In terms of what stories are behind that, there are three stories from the Babylonian world that scholars understand as being ancestors of the flood story. The oldest is the one that modern scholars, the ancients, didn't, of course, call Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian text. The Sumerian Empire was the one before the Babylonian in that same region. So it's simply called Eridu Genesis because it has things similar to our book of Genesis. And note some of the things in here, the creation of kingship, the first cities, but also the Great Flood. So this is the oldest one. Then the second oldest one is the Epic of Atrahasis. And as it's recognized here, written in the reign of this king, roughly 17th century BCE, so 1,000 years before the Babylonian exile. And then some of this is quoted in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is what you see here. And that's the one that was originally understood, and you'll see in one of my charts, as a parallel to Genesis. So what's at issue here is some aspects of the Gilgamesh Tablet 11 echo Genesis very closely, but some aspects of the Atrahasis epic echo Genesis a little more closely than Gilgamesh story does. This is part of Babylonian tradition, of course, that one leads to the next and the next leads to the third, in the same way that we could, in one of my other series, we're going to see how the books of Samuel lead, for example, to the books of Chronicles. Much different piece in the Bible, but later stories about the same characters, David and Solomon and Saul and such. So we don't need to worry ourselves about these differences. What I'd like to show you is some of the implications of these differences, and that's what we can see here when we when we look at these parallels here. So I'm going to use this chart for a number of things, but I want to focus right here. So here are aspects of the parallels between Gilgamesh Tablet 11 and Genesis 6 to 9 that led scholars to think, wait a minute, this can't just be a coincidence. I'm not going to go over these in detail. Some of this we'll see as we go through the story, and of course I'll post these on the website so you can read it in detail for yourself. But a couple of clear things. For example, the use of the word pitch, Hebrew kofar, from the Akkadian kupru. Plainly, Hebrew is taking the Akkadian word and forming a Hebrew-like word around it to use that. So there are a number of these things that certainly suggest it's not a coincidence, and the Babylonian stories are obviously older than the Babylonian exile, and there's no reason to think that the flood story would be written before that. What would have been the relationship between biblical people, biblical author people, not the biblical character people, and the Babylonians before the exile? They wouldn't have had much encounter with that culture at all. So there are many narrative parallels. There are also many theological contrasts, and I'll show you that now, but we'll come back to it later when we look at the theological aspects of how to interpret the flood story itself. So another piece of this, in addition to the Mesopotamian context, is historical. Plainly, the advent of historical scholarship, as I've been trying to explain so far, began to undermine the question of whether the flood story in the Bible was conveying historic events. That doesn't stop people in the modern world from just taking it that way, regardless of what anybody else thinks about it. So here's one example of that. This is from the Ark Encounter Museum in Kentucky, where, notice the phrasing on their webpage. What was the real Noah's Ark like? How many animals did the ark carry? It's not asking the question about was it real. It assumes it's real, and you can see that here, and it shows it in relation to things that we know are real, the Challenger and SpaceX Starship, to give it more of a realistic context. So there are people like that, including having this full-size Ark museum that you can go get tickets to and go visit and explore as if it was a museum. That's the most radically literal taking of this as historical events. There's versions of that are less intense from the Institute of Creation Research here in Dallas, Texas. Certainly a conservative viewpoint, but raising the question about the relationship with science. And there's a bunch of science here talking about ice ages, but plainly these folks are taking the Genesis flood as if it's a literal event and then correlating it with other things to try to give it some other context. You could also find agnostic and atheist sort of pages that suggest that the whole Bible is nonsense and there's no reason to think about this at all. But I'd like to give us one other view. Apart from just taking it literally or trying to force science to back up the historical truth of the Bible, we can just recognize that there were ice age floods. And where I'm writing from in the Seattle metropolitan area, I'm certainly aware, as some of you may well be, of the flooding from the destruction of glacial Lake Missoula, roughly 18,000 years ago, as the last ice age began to recede, 2,000 foot deep and many miles across lake that spread out and basically created the tablelands that are eastern Washington and much of Idaho, as you can see there. Was there such a flood like that in the Middle East? There isn't specific evidence for it, but there certainly are flood stories from all over the world, and that's another thing I could have brought up that I didn't happen to bring up here. But there are flood stories from almost every religious culture, because whether it's a great flood like glacial Lake Missoula or the global flood that the Genesis story is suggesting, as the Ice Age succeeded and as other events happen, there are floods. And floods that wipe out areas certainly would lead to stories about why that happened, whether it's because people were bad or the gods were angry or whatever each culture's explanation for those kinds of things are. I suggest that there may have been some historical event that was in the memory of people, but that ends up having little to do with the story as we actually read it in its context here. So I'm going to take this as a fictional story to say that Noah is not a real person that actually lived, and the story is constructed to accomplish a true theological purpose. As I've been saying throughout this Genesis series, and I would say throughout all my series, the Bible is full of true stories, and some of them even happened, which is to say that fiction can often be truer than nonfiction. So I won't take it as historical, and if you do, you might not find this as helpful. But presumably you wouldn't have come to this web page if you were trying to read it literally. Then there's narrative context, and there's a few pieces of that. And we're going to look at that also in relation to the causal one, because as you can see on the left side of the screen in my biblical text there, it's really only in 6:14 that we begin to get the ark story, make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Up until this, there's the question of violence and causation of what is it that humans have done wrong that upsets God, but there isn't flood yet. So we're going to look in a few minutes at how the three pieces at the beginning of chapter 6 each can be used as a setup, because perhaps strangely, it's not clear exactly what the problem is that the flood is seeking to address. But before we get to that, let's look a little at the narrative context of it more widely. So I've also provided for us here some links. So here's, before we get to the links, Hebrew words found only in the flood story in Genesis. Something about this is telling us that there's something unique here. You can see all these different words, some of them related, not surprisingly, to an ark, like pitch and roof and things like that. Topics that simply don't come up elsewhere in Genesis. But other things like windows or doves or ravens or olives or rain, those kinds of things might well come up, but they don't. These are things only used in this place in Genesis. And then also, I provided for you here echoes of the first two chapters, the creation stories. And you can see there are many of those here. And whether we're talking about the P version of the creation stories or the J version, or the P or the J version of the flood story, depends on where we see the echo. So again, I won't go through all of these. We'll go through them in detail as we go through the text. But it's certainly suggesting that the flood story is meant to echo the creation and basically be an uncreation and a recreation. So we'll see at the hinge right here in 8:1, as the waters have reached their peak and are about to recede and God remembers them, God makes a wind to blow over the earth, and the word for wind, ruach, there is exactly the same as the Spirit of God. So here translated as a wind from God that swept over the face of the waters. So a decreation and a recreation is certainly one of the narrative contexts that we need to pay attention to. Another aspect of the narrative context we need to pay attention to is how does this fit in with the rest of Genesis going forward. Traditionally, scholars have treated Genesis 1 to 11, as I've continued to do here, as what they call the primeval history. These stories of sort of before real history, whatever we think that means, and that starts with the call of Abram, later to be Abraham, and his wife Sarai, later to be Sarah, into this life that their children follow. The story follows their children throughout the rest of Genesis, and then into the book of Exodus. And then we get the rest of the narrative that we know. But Theodore Hebert, who's been a scholar of Genesis primeval history stories for a long time, has challenged us recently, and what I found was a very helpful article here, Dividing Genesis, the Role of the Flood in Biblical History and the Shape of Israel Identity. And Hebert argues it's the flood story that's the turn, on a number of reasons. First of all, the reason that I just gave you, that there's a decreation and a recreation, and there isn't such a thing in the Abram story, but also the covenant, as we'll see. There's a covenant here established and a change of conditions, as we'll see, that first humans were meant to eat from the trees, and then now humans are allowed to eat meat. Humans were friendly with the animals, and now the fear and dread of humans is put on the animals. So I'm going to start following Hebert's, or at least explore it as we go, idea that the flood story was the turning point, and that after that, the rest of the text of Genesis flows. No pun intended around flow there. So translational issues we'll look at as we go. I just showed you some of the Hebrew words that are unique here, and since they're unique, that raises questions of how to translate them. Some of them are unique to Genesis, and so they have a use elsewhere, so we can know more about them. But some are unique to this place, and the Greek doesn't always correspond. So as we go through this, we're going to have to look, as we've been doing all along, but especially in this story, to where the Hebrew and the Greek may be different and help us to understand the story. So in terms of the causation, what exactly is the problem? And I've provided this for us here, so perhaps this is helpful. And we've looked at the first two of these in the previous videos. We've not looked at the third one so far. So three things that have happened that lead to some sense of dissatisfaction in God's mind or voice here. So let's look at them just briefly again. The first one is about the sons of God choosing to mate with human women. And then that leads Yahweh to say, as you can see in the red verse 3 there, my spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh, etc. And that led the Jewish writers in the Midrash and some others later to argue about the question being sexuality that crosses divinely made boundaries. In other words, the sons of God as divine creatures are mating with not their own kind, and since Genesis 1 was all about according to their kind, and we'll see that again in the flood story as well, this violation of the species boundary, if you will, is a disordering of creation and upsets God. Or perhaps this isn't what they were thinking in the Midrash, but more recent scholars have argued, including people like George Nicholsburg, arguing from the parallels with First Enoch, which we've looked at before and we'll look at some more, that the sons of God represent human beings who claim to be divine, like kings in other cultures, and then are providing marriages around that. And so is it not so much about the question of sexuality, but about politics and theology, about kings who are claiming to be divine and bringing that influence into the world. So that's one set of possibilities. Following that is this next piece. Yahweh saw the wickedness of humankind as great and plots to blot them out after regretting that they were made. And yet, what is it exactly that's evil? That section suggested the evil is inherent and runs deep, but wickedness or evil are not self-defining. Unless we have categories of behavior or thinking that suggest, well, what is wicked behavior or evil behavior? It's hard to know exactly what it was about human beings that was evil or wicked, according to those verses. And perhaps that's what leads to this next section, right after the introduction of Noah and his family in verses 9 and 10. Now, the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. Well, violence is clear enough, although the Hebrew word for violence there, Hamas, doesn't necessarily mean physical violence. It can not only mean verbal violence, it can also mean violence like domination, like what we might call structural violence, where there's not necessarily physical violence, but unequal social orders. So the coming of kings and powerful people could be considered violent in the sense that a handful of elite are controlling the lives of others through their power. Similarly, the word for corruption can have a number of meanings, as we'll see when we look more closely. But just briefly, it can mean like a piece of clothing falling apart or a piece of produce that's getting rotten. But it can also have a social implication, not of corruption like someone who's on the take, someone who's taking money to use their official power incorrectly or illegally, but corrupt in the sense that a social order is not what it was meant to be, that it's not following the form it was meant to be as a whole. But the text doesn't specify any of that, so we don't know why the earth was corrupt, and what would that mean the earth was corrupt as opposed to the human societies on the earth? How could the earth itself be corrupt? And you see it's repeated a couple of times. Another question in relation to that is, what about the non-humans? If we're reading this sequentially, as ordinary readers do, that it starts in 6:5-8 from the wickedness of humankind, what's the problem with the non-humans? What have they done to deserve this punishment? And none of this is clear. So those are questions we're going to have to look at as we go. A couple more quick things, because I know even this overview is going on a little bit long. His characterization. Noah has nothing to say in the flood story. He will say something at the end after the flood story in relation to his getting drunk and his son seeing his nakedness. But he doesn't question Yahweh. He doesn't ever say anything at all in response. And as we saw briefly earlier, and we'll look at this more in the Darren Aronofsky Noah film, we see Russell Crowe does speak there. He does question it, because for Aronofsky, Noah's silence here is not perfect saintly obedience, but inhumanity. And it's following from inhumanity that follows from divine inhumanity, which is to say, why is everybody being destroyed? It certainly can't be the case that all humans, and certainly not all the rest of the animals, were evil in some terrible way that they didn't deserve to live, that there's no other solution. And later in Genesis, we'll see, when God determines to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because of the outcry, Abraham argues with God about it, and God relents. So since certainly the authors of the flood story know the Abraham story, are we meaning to understand Noah's obedience here as something to be praised or something to be criticized? Is relationship with God meant to be argued with and worked through, as Jewish Midrash traditionally does, or simply quietly listened to and responded, as some kinds of Christianity seem to promote? More in theory, though, in practice. And what about the characterization of Yahweh? We saw at the beginning a Yahweh who makes things and sees them they're all good and provides abundance, and it's all been beautiful and wonderful. And now suddenly God is not only regretful, but violently destructive. just tearing it all down and starting all over again, was seeming without any concern for what the effect will be on any of these creatures as they see the floods open up and die. And again, the Aronofsky film shows some of the horror of that readers of the story tend to pass over, especially when the flood story becomes a kid's book or a kid's song. Noah, he built him an arky, makes it all sound so friendly. But obviously this story is anything but friendly. So we're going to have to look more closely at the characterization of Noah and Yahweh, because no other characters in the story have any chance to be characterized. Noah's sons and his wife and his sons' wives simply do what they're told according to what Noah tells them, and we know nothing about what their experience of this whole thing is. And then finally, theologically, what exactly is the point of the story? Is it to say that God is not a good creator? Because if there's a flaw in human beings, if there's something at the core of humans that's evil and that leads God to have a second plan starting in the covenant in chapter 9, well, whose fault is it? There's nobody here but the Creator, and there's no sense in Genesis that any other forces, no devil or other such things, are influencing people. There's only Yahweh, Elohim, and human beings. And so what is it telling us here about these relationships? Are humans bad in some way that leads to what later Calvinist theology, even in a Christian context, sees as depraved and therefore not worthy of anything except condemnation, except for the arbitrary grace of a God whose will we can't really ever understand? That certainly isn't the Genesis perspective, but that perspective can certainly grow out of what we can see here of a God who simply destroys all who are not following God's ways. Or is it more complex than that? And what about the relationship with non-human creation? And we'll see a number of more recent interpretations that hear this as an ecological story. It's primarily about that God created the good earth and put humans on it to care for it, but humans have filled it with violence. So for the sake of the earth, God is destroying these false caretakers and putting the new caretakers, the later humans, in place with different rules for how to do that. I won't try to resolve the theological questions now, but certainly it's something we need to be thinking about here, about what is the relationship between humans, between Yahweh and God, if you will, as two different perspectives, or Yahweh, God as one perspective, and all non-human creation. Well, that's a lot before we even start the story, but I hope the handouts that I'll post on the webpage and this video will help you at least to enter into it as we go next time into those verses from 6:9 to 13. See you then. Bye-bye.